Thank you so much. So first of all, I want to thank Siobhan and Felicity and Susan for the introduction and also kind of making this space, because I think these things start off as a love and then they become a labour of love, and often they just become a labour when you have to deal with universities. So thank you so much for really a gift of a really nice day. I know it's very hot, probably not good considering the topic we're discussing. If you need to stand up, have a stretch, go and take a bio break, don't worry, I have 2 under 10s, I'm not distracted by anything. So please feel free to use the space as makes you feel comfortable. So I've really been looking forward to listening to everyone and talking to everyone, but at the same time I've had a bit of a kind of anxiety attack around what a business school professor can actually tell such an interdisciplinary audience about menopause that you might see as interesting or insightful or even accurate in terms of menopause. And I think this is probably part of that unlearning in terms of our socialised, gendered, age, life course, in terms of what we should be and whether we should have voice in spaces. But I think it's also about thinking about that voice and authority. So I'm not menopausal, I've not had direct lived experience of menopause, although I think my body's probably telling me it's rumbling in the distance somewhere. But I think also that anxiety has probably come from the idea that when I talk to menopause in academia, if I talk to menopause in organisations, with executive boards, with policymakers and intergovernmental groups, there's always a bit of queasiness about what menopause actually is. And part of that, I think, comes down to the idea that when we talk about menopause, we're often relying on shaky ontological grounds. In terms of what we think it is, and I'm going to discuss that a little bit in a moment. And I think this conditions menopause into being quite vulnerable to being territorialised, being appropriated and being served up in ways that actually foreclose a recognition of its generative, of its creative and of its plural potentialities that it actually holds. Now, central to this and my interest is in organisational and organising technology. So that's basically things that happen in organisations through policies and processes, but also organising in terms of the building blocks of life that make sense and make us do particular things. And I'm going to use the term menopause here to discuss that kind of journey leading up to and just after menopause. Now, these technologies, these organising technologies, work in tandem with social, with political and institutional norms, and they render women's lives less recognisable, less valued and less celebrated. But what I want to suggest today is that if we show how menopause comes to be both organisational and organising, is that we can listen to experiences of menopausal women and people who menstruate, and that holds possibilities for more generous experiences and encounters beyond a compulsion of trying to possess or appropriate or control gendered ageing and its other. And that shapes a lot of the contemporary menopausal movement in much of the global north and increasingly in the global south. Now, it's lovely to be in an audience where I don't have to explain, a 101 what menopause is and what menopausal transition is, although I'm aware that, sometimes we can assume that we're all talking about the same parameters here. But instead of doing that, I'm going to start at where I actually started from 20 years ago. Don't worry, I'm not going to tell the story of my 20-year career. I know we're short of time. So where did I start 20 years ago when I began researching ageing in and around the labour market? Now, at the time, Europe was on the cusp of introducing legislation around age discrimination to protect individuals in employment. And there were various kind of policy rumblings around retirement ages, around pension eligibility, and around extending working lives. And my initial doctoral research was focused on how line managers and supervisors negotiate what constitutes legitimate age differentiation as opposed to illegitimate age differentiation that could end you up in an employment tribunal. But what I actually found in this is that there was an immediate unease when I started talking to managers, because what was happening was that this legislative transformation wasn't actually changing the landscape at all. In fact, it wasn't unsettling ideas about ageing at work as I first expected. Rather, it seemed there was a doubling down on real normative orders around different bodies at work and how they're expected to grow up and older in relation to the labour market. And this has really marked out the cause of where I've been going for the past 20 years. So rather than explore the how to avoid age discrimination, as I set up to do, and I also told the SRC that's what I was doing with our scholarship. Anyone who's got a PhD scholarship here, they don't check what you do, so do what you want to do. And any of the supervisors, sorry for saying that. So instead of exploring that, I took the kind of metaphorical red pill, and I began looking at the ways that ageing and its intimate interlocutors, such as gender, really came to be organised in late capitalism. So I started out with this. This is an Austrian image called the Old Wives' Mill, and the idea here is it's kind of iconography in Austria, and the idea is that you kind of the men bring their old wives in, they go through this mill and they're rejuvenated in some way, and this is part of kind of popular culture in Austria. So what did I find out here? Well, broadly speaking, this is what I kind of found out in my PhD research and afterwards. And broadly speaking, what you can say is it's shorthand for how women get screwed at each point of their working lives. Okay, or to put it more eloquently, Colin Duncan and Wendy Loretto talk about never the right age in employment. Okay, so either you kind of start off and you've got the kind of perfection principle, you're paralysed by doing anything wrong. You know, if you do something that's 99% right, you always focus on that 1%, and you're encouraged to do so by your colleagues. You then have this kind of fertile +1, where you're kind of seen as demanding the ideas surrounding childcare and balancing. You then move on to a kind of care-orientated accommodation. I would say, of course, these are tropes, these are archetypal tropes, okay? Care-accommodated accommodation, both outside the organisation in terms of sandwich caring, we talked a bit about that, but also within the organisation, where you're actually seen as kind of the mothering manager doing all that kind of office housework. And then finally, where you think you're kind of getting a bit of breath work in there, you either become invisible as an older midlife woman, or you become hyper visible and problematic, the stereotype of the cranky old woman in the workplace. Okay. Now, paying attention to how women are placed within these identities, what we actually see is the working life course is governed by what Freeman calls a chrononormativity. And chrononormativity governs the way different bodies are encouraged to follow a normative path. Now, I've tweaked this slightly and I refer to chronophalism as the way that bodily experience is compelled into aged patriarchal modes of being throughout the life course. So here, women's professional identities are always one of conditional acceptance. I think anyone who's probably been in any room in any workplace will probably testify to this. So it's conditional, and this gendered ageist footprint does not necessarily determine who we are, it does not necessarily determine recognition, but it certainly shapes the conditions that enable and constrain our practices at work and in our career, and compel us to recognise that there are easier or more difficult paths that we can tread, should we wish to be recognised in particular ways in our working lives. So for me, this gendered working life course isn't an interesting aside when we're talking about menopause. It's actually the heart of it, in terms of menopause and women's bodily encounters and episodes. But it's also central to the way that we come to live in and through the experience of menopausal transition. In other words, we can see that menopause is organised through different institutional, organisational and chronophalic canons. So I'm going to give an example of this through thinking of the 3 C's as organising principles here. Menopause is controlled through power, through hierarchy in terms of roles or norms. Menopause is commodified in terms of shoring up value through presenting women's bodies a particular way. And menopause is conferred in terms of how we're hailed into particular positions or compelled to follow particular lines. Now, these will all be probably, this kind of manifestation of these 3 C's will probably all be familiar to you in terms of, especially if you're based in the UK over the past few years, and we've had a kind of discussion of this already, where menopause has become a kind of trending topic in the UK. And it's really been a really important example of how gendered ageing has entered a lexicon of organisational and institutional life in a number of ways. Now, according to its advocates, its main justification of this menopausal workplace revolution has been to recover employees' experiences of menopause transition and consider how workplaces might best support menopausal workers. And there have actually been some excellent inroads made by academics, by practitioners, by thought leaders and activists to try and ensure that menopause is on the organisational agenda in terms of supporting employees. So I'm not anti-market, I'm not anti-commercial exchanges, and I'm very aware of academics critiquing aspects whilst actually reproducing and shoring up value for menopausal bodies themselves. I also know that the intention behind these things is usually based on good faith. However, At the same time, we're never completely in control of the things that we try and do and produce. And what we see is that this move has been accompanied by a growing menopausal market around training, around consultancy, around mentoring, around thought leadership, as well as supplements, nutrition, lifestyle coaching, specialist clothing, bedding and footwear. So I think the kind of end of this has been the menopausal almonds that I think Stella, you mentioned now. And we're actually doing a paper just now to understand what happened there with the menopausal almonds. That was a breach when actually we know that the lesser effects are happening in the market already. But that's for the birds at the moment. Now this particularly focuses on supporting women, as we've heard through the earlier conversations, with significant financial means and cultural capital. Okay? We also know it benefits particular markets. So you can have a menopausal accreditation scheme that starts around £1,500. You have brand ambassadors for menopause inclusive products that have published reports. And we find that the lines of knowledge, information and commerce are actually blurred here in terms of what we're trying to do. Now, importantly, these aspects are produced with often the best of intentions. Often people come to it because of their lived experience of menopause and want to support women. But the commercial enduring interest is in white middle-class professional women, and that market invariably informs the production of knowledge. Messages are embodied by the presence of founders and thought leaders. We can hire speakers for events, often celebrities that range from 6,000 up to 25,000, and it shapes who we see talking about and embodying menopause, and what we come to expect to see as the menopausal working body, and what we expect them to do to control and maximise their potential as fully agential subjects. So how does this actually work? Well, this is a kind of 101 of how markets often operate, okay, in terms of a commodification of market. What you usually do is you start out with kind of market segmentation. In other words, what part of the market is going to be most valuable, most profitable, okay? And then from there, what you do is you generate a momentum, okay? You usually have a kind of problematic discourse. This has happened with aging narratives around about the 1990s. It's happening with menopause. It happens in other markets as well. So we create a momentum. What is the problem? And then, ta-da, we've got a market that frames the solution, okay? Provides the solution for us. We then refocus and generalise that market. So we're interested in the market segmentation group, but we're also saying that this is for everyone. So we're kind of doing an almost pseudo-democracy of the market solution. And then what really helps if we have a kind of authentic brand. So we usually have a thought leader, we have a kind of owner who really embodies what we're trying to do there. Okay, so hopefully you can kind of see how this is actually operating in terms of how menopause is being organised by market forces. Now, of course, this produces a certain ageing aesthetic, but more importantly, these market-driven voices encourage a singularity when they become amplified and neutralised beyond that commercial interest. And there is therefore a danger that the selective experience of menopause presented is mistaken for the way that a majority of women experience menopause, even though we know that on average, a 51-year-old woman is more likely to work part-time in service, clerical or entry-level jobs, have about a wage of about 30,000 a year, and could spend up to half their life in ill health in certain socioeconomic groups. Now, I've done quite a bit of work with NHS and with governments and various kind of organisational bodies, and when you're talking to them, you can see how these 3 C's of commodification and conferral and control really feed into the way that menopause is systematically subject to misdiagnosis, underdiagnosis and late diagnosis. Okay, so I'm sure we probably all know what they are in various forms. Misdiagnosis is when people face usually unnecessary and often invasive tests and sometimes treatments because they're not seen as matching the boxes of a subject in menopause. Underdiagnosis is when the experience of symptoms is sent away with a kind of 2 paracetamol and a box of tissues approach, when rather than actually seeking valid medical help and support. Or late diagnosis, where women spend years and years seeking support, or have actually had previous negating experiences with health-seeking behaviour to the extent that they just don't even bother going to their healthcare provider. And I think most people in this room have probably had that experience in terms of reproductive health. So in terms of our own journey in terms of reproduction, I remember when my son was born, I was told by a doctor, whilst he was in labour, and these are the words because I've written them down, he said, "Darling, birth is not like the movies, so just take the drugs." Okay, when I was in labour. Yeah, my partner did very well to exit him before a kind of another abuse happened. And then I was actually sent home, then had to come in for a 4-pint blood transfusion. Okay. Similarly, when I went to my doctor and said, My second daughter was born at 25 weeks prematurity, and I said, well, I'm worried I might be entering into perimenopause. I've got increased heart disease. And the doctor said, oh, I think you're a bit paranoid and overreacting there, okay? So these are happening to me as a white, middle-class, privileged body. And of course, we know this unholy trinity of miss, under, and late diagnosis is even more the case for those whose experience cuts across multiple intersections of power, who are actually often the global majority. So where does this organisation of menopause leave us? Well, for one, it suggests that we can't actually think about the intimate corporeal experience of menopause, the bodily experience of menopause, without thinking of the political economy in and through which menopause is governed, including through the interplay between economic relations and political systems. I think the work that Noemi's doing is actually fantastic because, like it or not, numbers talk to policymakers, okay, and they will listen to that far more than any kind of frivolous lived experience of rich interviews that we do, which is horrendous but true. So thank you for doing your work, Noemi. Now, when I've got my kind of game face on when I'm talking to policy and companies, and it kind of sticks in my throat, that idea of, impact and whether I'm actually complicit in garnering value from menopausal bodies myself for my own career and profiting for that. I try and emphasise that it's actually crazy to even think about women in the workforce as being engaged and thriving and not being underemployed, whilst they're being unsupported and unheard in other institutional spaces, especially because we know from research that there's a two-way relationship with menopause. So menopause does affect work, but work environments do affect menopause. For example, we know there's evidence that supervisory support does result in reporting less bothersome symptoms of menopause. However, I also think, and I want to turn to this point now, that it also detracts from us looking at actually the richness of menopause as a gendered, aged, experiential realm. And it has far more generative possibilities for rethinking organisational subjectivities as we grow up and older. At least we know the mic's working, right? So how am I kind of trying to approach this in some of my work? So I'm going to kind of touch upon a couple of studies that I've done to try and think about what's actually happening in terms of encouraging a plural generative menopausal account of menopausal experience. The first one was a study of 40 women, all over the age of 40, who had significantly changed the course of their working life after the age of 40. And that led to a collaborative photography-led project informed by Gilmour's autobiographic, so thank you for someone for introducing it earlier on, that we used. And I worked with a professional photographer and the women to talk about how they present themselves in photos. In terms of an economic perspective. The second one was a 10-year project where I followed the lives of people who worked in a hedge fund. So a hedge fund is basically a branch of the financial services, and they trade large sums of money, usually for private investors or institutions, through complex financial trading models. And I followed them every 2 years, so I went back to interview them every 2 years to talk about their experience of growing up and older. Now these studies weren't exclusively about menopause, although it's nearly always discussed, but what it actually does highlight is that menopause is a vital part of the story of how women negotiate and traverse ageing subjectivities in what's quite an ambivalent economic landscape. And now I use the word ambivalent deliberately here because it speaks to how menopausal disclosure in the world is necessary but double-edged. So phenomenologically speaking, if you'll indulge me a little bit, disclosure is a kind of reaching out into the world, and that is both kind of ontological in terms of we need to do it to engage in the world, but also a very practical activity, so the way we engage with colleagues, with managers, with markets, with other institutional stakeholders. So if we think about disclosure of menopause as both a practical accomplishment, it's something we choose to do in a particular way, and a condition of sociality, it's something that's part of an amalgam of being in the world and our compulsion to want to be in the world, even if the world doesn't want us in the way that we think that we are. And we do this through roles and through tasks and through taking up informal and formal labour and engaging with labour markets in particular ways, and also how we consume. However, and this is the rub, in reaching out in kind of that disclosure, we also render ourselves vulnerable to misinterpretation. The self that we seek to verify and validate begins to crumble in the eyes of others around us. Okay, as Simone de Beauvoir, and I'm going to use de Beauvoir here, and I'm aware that I'm doing it when we have like French professors who are experts in de Beauvoir here. So please excuse my interpretation. As Simone de Beauvoir suggests, at every moment others are stealing the whole world away from us. In other words, we might find that that curiosity, that desire we have to put ourselves out in the world is not reciprocated, at least in the ways that we desire. And this pushes our menopausal selves back onto us and back into us, imprinting on our interior lives. And to add to further complexities we discussed, these corporeal selves are porous. They're porous infrastructures. We're temporally charged beings. And by this I mean we're not only accumulative in terms of our own histories and other histories, but also we're politically situated and dynamically situated organic entities. So in menopause, we find ourselves having to contend with the turbulence of bodily episodes, as well as contend with our own compostability. Now, because of this, events such as menopause are never our own making, but they require us to uphold our menopausal experience alongside our own temporal integrity in the face of a labour market where women are in general either never enough through a youth-laden perfection principle, or too much or excessive, as we see the tropes of the grumpy old women that we discussed earlier. And I want to turn to Simone de Beauvoir to think through this a little bit more, because she's one writer, she's not the only one, but she's one writer who's engaged quite explicitly with gendered ageing. Now, I'm noting here as a caveat that many of her actual empirical narrations of ageing and the menopause are less than positive, and probably not the most useful part of that oeuvre of her writing. And I also want to recognise that in our own life and relationships, we actually see age and power operating in quite sinister ways, particularly for the young women in her and Jean-Paul Sartre's intellectual circles. However, I think that Beauvoir's theoretical cartography really does provide us with a means to understand the phenomenology of menopause, as it becomes a site for considering how we grasp at these ideas and experiences and relationships. She provides us with ways of speaking to the desire for us to hold on to something, be it a sense of recognising ourselves, being recognised by others, or feeling a sense of our place in the world. This holding on to something is often achieved through staying aligned with normative but elusive gender age-based aspirations and identifications, as imprinted on the landscape and trajectories of working lives. Yet grasping also sits quite uneasily with a desire to know me, often as the older self, and the possibilities that accompany this. A me that had previously perhaps been viewed as other, or even alien, to use Simone de Beauvoir's own term. So I guess the question that we're asking ourselves here in terms of this temporal integrity that often underpins menopause is, can I have become a different being whilst I still remain myself? Now, the menopausal subject as other is probably the most obvious landing place to first go there, and probably people in the room can better explain this than me, but when we talk about the other, what we're saying is that the other of menopause operates as a relational but marginalised corollary of the dominant norm of the one. In other words, the menopausal subject is secondary. They're inessential but necessary in order to stabilise, to confirm, and to valorise the one, the norm. This feeds into different but related modalities of workplace othering that manifest in middle-aging work, such as, for example, older women doing a disproportionate amount of the office housework for the young up-and-coming stars that we need to foster. The unreciprocated care expected of what Leanne Cutcher calls mothering managers in the workplace. Importantly, the menopausal other is not a position that's challenged, unfortunately, by much of the mainstream narrative. And in the case of menopausal markets, it's either positively reinforced or reproduced, often for the sake of power. Even when it is challenged, it seeks to replace one singularity with another singularity, which I'm going to talk about as being a real problem. Okay, let's think about it a bit more positively, however, because I actually think that the inessential but necessary othering is only one part of a story of menopause, and by no means redolent of the fullness of menopausal lives, particularly in the accounts of women who feel that menopause signals a time of growth, of generative possibilities, and of feeling more of themselves than ever before. So is there a generative agency that we might hope for in terms of menopausal subjectivities? So to consider this, I want to reflect on some of the empirical accounts that I've been really lucky to listen to over the years, and the kind of differential patterning that I start seeing happen here. I'm not going to draw corollaries because you'll be terrified that I'm not going to use statistical accounts, but what I've seen in over 20 years of talking to people, there's a distinct patterning between masculinities and femininities and how people talk about growing up and older. Now, I don't mean this in terms of, I don't want to introduce the what about men question, because I always get asked that in presentations, not in this audience, but everywhere I go, I talk about menopause and I think I've got them and they're like, oh, but what about men? Now, I usually, that's absolutely fine. The other question I always get asked is, when is International Men's Day? And I've always got to kind of go, it's 19th of November rather than every bloody day. So which is what I want to reply. But anyway, that's an aside. So what I actually see is when I'm talking to, when I've spoken to men or kind of, we can say, masculinely aligned subjects, and I couldn't have found it quite deeply unsettling. Because what I hear is that they're smart, successful, professional people who are often kind and they're reflective in many ways. They so often pursue a professional identity trajectory that is conditional upon becoming entrapped by a singularity of the self. In other words, they become bound by a selfhood where recognition is contingent on remaining immune to any loosening, any change, any recalibration of that grip, of that disclosure, of that form of reaching out into the world that we previously described in terms of disclosure. In fact, the grip becomes a mode of enclosure. They must be forever in control, forever autonomous, forever stable and immune to change. Even discussions of vulnerability during significant life events are affected through very convenient tropes about performing authentic leadership. And this authentic leadership, for example, I'll give you an example. One colleague, one person that I talked to over 10 years, he had a significant health event and he was in a coma for 3 months. And when we were talking about it, he said, oh, it's made me a better leader because I'm more authentic now. And it was a real kind of compulsion to maintain this singularity rather than actually really face fears about this change, about this compostability, the mortality, and of course vulnerability as well. Now this aspect of ageing, the singular aspect of ageing, is very much like as Linda Fisher discusses when she's extending de Beauvoir's conditions of othering, where she discusses ageing as other to myself, as in othering rooted in ageing fears and denial. And this is very much the case in terms of what we see happen in a lot of organisations. However, and by comparison, for women, there also seems to be a possibility of menopause being part of an ageing that is not other to myself, but other in myself. An alterity not born of hostility, duality and singularity, and therefore a far more expansive space to acknowledge the other as more intimate and less dichotomous and hostile than we are often compelled to do. Now that's not denying that menopause can be one of the biggest confrontations and the desire to kind of hang on to a sense of self, as they say. And it's often experienced even by those who want to embrace it, who want to embrace the change as kind of a queasy kind of disclosure. And that can be whether because it's chrononormative or because it's anachronistic, so those who experience early menopause kind of outside the time that we expect menopause to be in terms of earlier induced menopause. But what I'm saying is not only this experience. And in these final few moments, I want to suggest that the embodied, lived, experiential quality of menopause that we often see is different to this kind of singularity of ageing that we see here, where it makes the news that Biden, surprise, surprise, feels tired in his 70s. So what I want to kind of refer to here is this kind of, how does this actually happen? What's the potential for this happening? So I'm referring to this kind of idea of the embodied lived experience or quality of ageing confronting us to a multitude of ambiguities. And where do these actually come from? Well, they come from forms of bodily knowing and unknowing and not being and being that are surfaced and enacted in organising menopause in the ways that I discussed at the beginning. But in parallel, it's also about how menopause highlights the ambiguous onto-epistemological experiences through which we come to know ourselves in the world. And part of this capacity is born from the fact that, as others have mentioned, unfortunately, few women enter the menopause without having previously experienced alterity and conditional acceptance in the workplace, especially in workplaces where women are never the right age, as discussed earlier. Yeah, it's interesting how many women I've spoken to discuss this in terms of, for example, capacity building. So, for example, here we see Tina is quite specific about the muscle memory derived from ageist sexism when she was younger. Older women also discuss the experience of realising that the social and cultural script is a fraud. The exposure of chronophalism in terms of normative, aged patriarchal lines of flight opens up opportunities. Now, the menopausal other is still vulnerable to being a subject of terror and therefore a target of possession or repression. However, for women entering the menopause, as these reflections suggest, previous encounters to negotiate the practical outcomes of alterity and difference also cleave out a space to question the world as given and our own cumulative, situated and dynamic experience. I want to go actually one step further here, and I want to suggest that this not only provides a location to help practically negotiate menopause, and it's not only seeking a kind of ontological integrity as we work through menopause, it's also a way to begin thinking about the ethics of menopause. Now, Beauvoir suggests that morality resides in the painfulness of indefinite questioning, which sounds like a negative statement, but it's actually a really generative one, because I think I would interpret this indefinite questioning as happening when we must disclose our menopausal selves to the world, and that world is seemingly given, so it's seemingly objective, it's neutral, it's ready-made. But we must simultaneously suspend that givenness of the world through our existence as temporally dynamic beings. In other words, menopausal subjectivities are not fixed nor foundational, but lie within this oscillation of the world as given and the world as lived. And this produces an open, dynamic and ambiguous structure of lived experience and the basis for a potential ethical encounter through the other in myself. And this other in myself provides a quality to menopausal experience that, I would argue, loosens the compulsion to possess and colonise that singularity. So how can we actually utilise it? Well, I think without sounding too twee or Pollyanna-esque, I would actually suggest it's love. Now, in the Ethics of Ambiguity, Beauvoir suggests that it's only as something strange, forbidden, and something free that the other is revealed as another. And to love him, genuinely is to love him in his otherness and in that freedom by which he escapes. Love is then renunciation of all possession, of all confusion. One renounces being in order that there may be that being which one is not. Now, Beauvoir is actually talking about, love and passion between two people, but I'd actually suggest it's helpful to think about this in terms of the potential menopausal other in myself, in terms of a generous rather than hostile relation towards oneself and other subjectivities we hold. Of course, this is not an easy or simple renunciation. Getting rid of singularity requires confronting, reckoning, unlearning, relinquishing, recognising our own vulnerabilities, and yes, that we may have something to possibly lose in terms of power and voice, and also material status and position. But not doing so carries even higher stakes, even greater potential for loss. To go back to the point I made at the start, menopause lies on shaky epistemological grounds, and that means that we come to be organised, and when we come to be organised in menopause, it will always seek to create and reproduce uneven territories of women's bodies. They create enclosures and facilitate the capture of women's bodies that prioritises singularity. This means that, in the words of de Beauvoir, menopause subjectivities require us to recover the subject to recover its equilibrium every time it's upset. And most importantly, we must take the widest and strongest possible grip on the world. So I hope what I've conveyed today is that this grip on this world, this disclosure on the world as menopausal subjects, does not always have to revert to a subjectivity driven by possession and singularity that we're encouraged to do in our everyday workplaces. A singularity and possession that we're encouraged to do in the markets, encouraged by a singularity and possession that late capitalism compels in us. Menopause provides one sight or experience or a series of moments where we can at least loosen these binds. And we can't deny that menopausal modes of enclosure exist and are organised in particular ways through the interplays of broader dynamics of work, of consumerism, of practical and institutional objectives in ways that compel us to consider menopause as other to myself. But drawing on our own situated and dynamic experience of disclosure in that historical and biographical othered bodies that we see and that we stand in solidarity with also opens up a more plural world, a world where we can all reckon with bodily, life and other experiential changes without fear of completely losing ourselves. In other words, a world where we move beyond singularity to engage, contend and more generously grapple with the menopausal other in myself.
How long do we have, Siobhan, for questions? Maybe should we take it to 10 minutes?
So
So, anybody would like to ask the first question?
I think that was a really elegant presentation, so thank you very much. My
Are you referring to the fancy PowerPoint slides? Because that's my 9-year-old that did them. So. Or the content?
No, there was some excellent content here, but what you say to me is that we're all situated, and part of the way we see is based on how we're situated in place, in time, in a disciplinary perspective. How has you can't know how, if you were a French literary scholar, your conclusions might differ. How is your own disciplinary grounding situated you?
That's really interesting. So I've always been a bit of a polymath, a failed polymath, not a selective one. So my first degree was in the arts and social sciences, and I've looked at a variety of. I'm always interested in the unknown. So I've looked at smell at work, I've looked at haunted workplaces, and then I've kind of done the ageing stuff to legitimise my career and still my manager having high blood pressure. But I think one of the really interesting things that I really see is, it's very easy for us as academics to think the business world or the corporate world that's out there is as a bad object. But when you actually go and talk to people, they are just muddling along. They are faulty subjects as well. They are trying to do often what's best, despite the despite the outcomes of what they actually pursue. And I think from my own disciplinary perspective, getting to talk to these people and actually listen to them beyond this kind of coveted view of how we perhaps other than ourselves has allowed us to see, well, what are they actually contending with? What is stopping them, despite their best intentions, maintaining a singularity that leads to marginalisation, to othering, to disclosure? So, does that answer your question?
Yeah, it's a great start. That's another one of those questions that we need.
Yeah.
A glass of wine and a little
Yeah, definitely a glass of wine.
Thank you. Hi, Kat.
Hi.
Great presentation. Thank you. Very interesting. Lots to take in. Thinking about the body and that sort of physical self. And again, this is something that I'm sort of constantly grappling with every day as a researcher in this area. And I wondered your opinion on it. That I feel like I'm constantly feeling that tension between increasing awareness and wanting to talk about it, and we're very much incentivized to problematize things so we can publish 4-star journal articles. But then it's also that sort of not wanting to overstep the mark into exacerbating stigma and entering into that fear narrative, which I really try to do reject, but try not to step over it. And actually, one of my participants, I was talking to her, post interview when you have these chats, and she said, "It sounds like you're trying to walk a tightrope you can't see." And I feel like that's kind of what we're trying to do in this area. We're trying to create awareness, but for every 3 women I speak to who want more awareness about menopause, one just wants it to go away and to stop talking about it. And I actually raised that at a conference once, and I was actually heckled for even suggesting such a thing. So how do you walk that tightrope that we can't necessarily see in your own research?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I think it's a really important point because all this kind of discussion in what menopause for everyone who really thinks this is a fantastic thing, there is quite a backlash from women saying, this is my own private bodily experience. So we did a survey in NHS Scotland of around 6,000 women about menopause and menstrual health, and some of the feedback we got was like, it was stark because some women were like, fantastic, I'm so glad this has been vocalised and verbalised, fantastic. And we had others going, like, why are you asking me these questions? And one woman said, I work a 60-hour week and I've taken an hour out to tell you how badly you're doing it. Right? And she which is great. I mean, as a researcher, that's exactly what you want, right? That plurality of voices. So I think it's about, so what I would actually say is, and this goes down to the practical aspects of the nuts and bolts, this idea of disclosure is really important, because if what we're saying is, this disclosure is a double-edged sword, it's a double-edged sword ontologically, but it's also practically as well. And I think, if we operate in terms of the parameters of disclosure being around the women's lived experience, I don't want everyone to have to kind of disclose their menopausal status in order to feel that they're supported in an infrastructure of an organisational environment. But at the same time, what I want to make sure is that I'm not I'm actually speaking for them and providing conditions that would perhaps support any inclusive or changing body in the workplace. I mean, like we know from, without going to practitioner, you know, what we know is kind of the things that work are high impact, low resource solutions that actually benefit everybody, every changing body in the workplace, not just menopausal bodies. So it is that balance. But I wish I had the magic pill as to how you do that type, you walk that tightrope faultily.
Beauvoir would say about its paradoxical, you know, nature, ontology of life, that there's good and bad in virtually everything, or a negative and a positive to everything. So I'm reminded of the fact that Foucault, I mean, Margaret Gillette wrote about this years ago, but because the US had a menopausal moment well before we did, and she talked about the confessional, the Foucauldian confessional. Women were obliged to disclose that they were going through menopause, and it starts with a good impulse, like you said, and then other influences come in, and it suddenly becomes something of bigotry and maybe something that's commodified. Well, I wanted to ask a question, if I may, about, you know.
Can I see? Here's the French professor asking me a question,
well,
so we might be running out of time.
I'm a sociologist I was at an A level of French and extremely rusty, so, but I am a fan of Beauvoir, you are right about that, but I'm not a French professor. So I feel the same as you about using Beauvoir, actually. It's a funny thing, we need to talk about that.
Yeah, on a couch probably, I think.
Well, indeed. But my question is about the way that it's sometimes in the workplace, I'm sure you've come across this, younger women or other older women, and it sometimes is to their own gain professionally, and quite often ally themselves with older men in the organisation, or the other way around, the older men will ally themselves with younger women in the organisation. So how, you know, this whole idea of accepting the other in myself, I mean, how, I was thinking about this earlier on when we were talking the talk about Abu Dhabi and how the attempt to make menopause less stigmatised. I was thinking, well, you've got to start with menstruation because that's also very problematic. It's considered dirty in our culture. So, how do you get younger women to accept the other in myself that is years off? I mean, in some ways, we've got to work on very young women. Perhaps not putting a dividing. I mean, society does it, but also dynamically in the workplace, that can be quite opportunistically taken by young women who also don't think they'll ever have the menopause themselves. A bit like death, it won't happen to me. It'll happen to you, but not me.
Okay, so this is probably a scatterbomb of like things that I immediately think of here. I mean, I think one is these generational silos and wars that we're in. I've been in a lot of workplaces and I don't see them manifest. I rarely see them manifest in the way that when we're reading in popular culture in the media, they're supposed to manifest. Like, I'm not actually sure if this intergenerational tension is just
happens in my workplace.
Yeah, and I'm not denying if it happens, but I don't think it happens to the extent that we assume that that's actually the norm of relations at work. So that's the first thing. I think the second aspect is asking anyone to think about a futurity is really difficult, isn't it? And then if you add on top of that the kind of marginalisation of othering, like, so think about this and it's going to be not amazing, right? As Stella was saying, that's a kind of another challenge. And then I think the third aspect is what are we actually asking women to do? Because in one sense, I think asking them to think about the other and myself is almost the outcome. And the thing that we perhaps need to focus on is what is it that really compels them to have to follow those kind of, what Sarah would call those lines of directionality, those kind of chronophallic lines of directionality. And the reason is they're more comfortable, right? Even when we're marginalised, marginalisation can be a place of comfort, even if we know that we're being secretly shafted by the never the right age aspects. So I think the question becomes, isn't, how do we form solidarities and allyship through the other and myself? It's what are the conditions that are preventing and constraining women from following this line of directionality of chronophalism. And I think once we start there, that's a really productive place to start thinking about, well, if we can dismantle that a little bit, then there's the opportunity for a more kind of generative disclosure.
And isn't love, which you bravely mentioned, I think, part of that? Because love opens the possibility around disclosure. It opens the possibility for discovery, and it opens the possibility for lines not being so solid.
Yeah. Yes.
I do have a question, because I want to hear more about love.
You just get your own back now.
No, you let it be there, but I'm really interested in what you think it is for, and like, do you dare speak about it in workplaces when you're talking to people about policy?
Do you know, I think we all speak about it in workplaces, don't we? We just don't use the words that perhaps, you know, like being passionate about your work. Oh, I'm so busy. Oh, I'm really excited about doing this project. Oh, I can't wait to work with this person. These are all kind of canons of love. We just don't actually use the word, you know, like, and it's not, I'm not going to ask everyone like who loves their work, because, you know, but you know, like we all talk about it in the canons of love that Beauvoir talks about. We just don't use the word. We use a kind of corporate sanitized version of it. But I think, you know, people in general, people that I talk to, they love some aspect of their work. That might be they hate their job, but they love the people. It might be they love, you know, they love their job, but they hate the people. It might be that they love a particular task of it, but they hate another aspect. But I think there's always those elements, because that's the ties that bind us to it, right? That's the thing that really keeps us going. So do I talk about it? I wouldn't go in and say, oh, hi Barclays, I'm here to help you with your menopause policy. Don't you all love each other? And it's about love. But I think it's about thinking about those emotional ties that we have in those emotional relations as a really good starting place. And then we can start, you know, thinking about them as how do they operate in a way that's generous rather than about colonising our possession. And then actually what you find is it naturally goes to the idea of starting to think about othering in a bit more of a reflective way. So.
Well, is it about care? Is that a potential synonym in a way? Everything you said about love, in a way, care fits it exactly. I care about my work. I care about my colleagues, which is maybe a more, I don't know if it's a more acceptable term than love, but it seems to also fit the.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. Like, in some ways, care is a bit of a triggering word for me, because I think the way that it's been kind of used has been really appropriated, like, you know, like care of the self in workplaces, and, you know, the wellness agenda, where it's kind of like, oh, you know, we're gonna make you work 80 weeks, but we're gonna give you a free yoga every Friday. Do you know, like, kind of like there's a real cruel irony as to how care's been appropriated. But it's, you know, it's what Beauvoir says, isn't it? As soon as we put something out in the world, it's grabbed by people and made something that we don't want it to be. So I think you're right. The kind of, if we think about the care, the aspects of care that, you know, theoretically we talk about, absolutely, but the way that word actually is so loaded and like put into this like wellness agenda, it almost makes it hard to recover for me. Anyway, yeah. I'm aware of keeping people from coffee.
That's a fascinating discussion, but I think we've probably come to the end now, so thanks so much, Kath.
Thanks so much for your